Welcome to the Empowerment Show with Melissa Heisler. Every week, discover new personal choices with practical, inspiring guides. And now, here's Melissa.
Welcome to the Empowerment Show. I'm Melissa Heisler from It's My Life, and it is your life. Live it. Today, I will be talking with Cindy Trawinski and Rami Henrich from Lifeworks about marginalized populations. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa.
Well,
thanks for inviting us.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. I think it's really interesting work that you do because most of the work you do are with what you call marginalized populations. Can you tell us a little bit about the people you work with and why you use that term?
Sure, Melissa. I think that when I think about the word marginalized, I think about anyone who doesn't feel part of the mainstream of society. So it could be someone from the LGBT population, people who identify as polyamorous, or maybe I'll need to define that in a moment, or people who are part of the kink community, BDSM community. Could be people who identify as part of a Jewish population or Muslim population. It's a very wide umbrella, but it's also specific to people who feel that they don't belong somewhere in the mainstream of our culture.
Okay. And maybe you do want to go through some of those terms. I recognize some of the acronyms, but not all of them. So maybe you want to just give us a brief definition of some of those.
Sure. Cindy, you want to give it a go?
Yeah. So Rami mentioned LGBT, and there's Q. That would be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and queer individuals. These are people who don't identify primarily as heterosexual, but have chosen some other kind of sexual identification. I think most people are familiar with lesbian, gay folks. So the people who choose partners of the same sex for romantic or sexual relationships. Then there's transgendered folks who are individuals who may experience themselves as not really fitting in the body they were born into, seeking to identify with another sex or sexuality. And then queer, which is also a huge umbrella term, which really has to do with defining your sexuality, your gender, as you choose, which may mean that you embrace a kind of fluid gender or sexual identity. It may change from moment to moment, from day to day, or over a period of time. But there's a reluctance to identify with the traditional categories that we know.
And that's very interesting that to talk about that, because I know when I was in theater, so I was very involved with that community, and there was almost a stigma on the other side that to have the label of gay, even back in my day, to say you were bi was something that was marginalized within that group. So it's really interesting that we're at the point now that we can begin to identify and accept individuals who maybe might be not certain about their sexuality moment to moment. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
There's always also, just to comment on what you're saying, there's always within group marginalization as well as between groups. So we often think of marginalization as occurring between the mainstream and some smaller group or some individuals who might be outside of the mainstream, for lack of a better term. But outside of the mainstream, in that in these marginalized groups, whatever they are, there's also additional layers of differentiation and in-group, out-group kinds of dynamics and politics that go on.
Go ahead, Rami.
Well, I was also going to say something about polyamory, because I think that most people are still not aware of polyamory, and that has to do with people who identify as loving more than one person at a time. So they may have more than one, they may have a primary partner and another lover. There are so many different constellations, but that's been happening. People are coming out now more and more as the LGBTQ people have a chance to be more in the mainstream. Those who have been in the background and not seen seem to be coming up more and wanting to be part of the dialogue. So that's the polyamory community in a nutshell. And I also mentioned kink, which has to do with BDSM practices. And people actually identify as kinky.
Okay.
So, yeah. So that's just a little bit about that.
All right, thank you. And with these different groups, are there different issues for the groups depending on which group they're in, or are there some experiences or challenges that all marginalized groups experience?
I'll start with the latter, because I think that there is a commonality in feeling that you don't belong. And not feeling like you belong, one might feel that there's something wrong with them, that there has been so much struggle to try and become part of the mainstream in the past, that it occurs in the family, it occurs amongst peers, and in the community, in the groups, and in the world in general. So I think that one of the things that I think is for those who feel like the world is against them or they don't have a place in the world, it's a sense of not feeling like they belong. And that's a very, very stressful experience, I'd say.
And it doesn't matter what group you identify with. You could be of a religious minority or a particular race or even an ethnic background. A lot of immigrants experience marginalization in new cultures. You are basically going to have that feeling of not being understood and not having a place in society at large that is the same and that has the same privileges and rights and freedoms that other people seem to experience. And that's the core dilemma for people who feel marginalized.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's both a societal issue of whether or not I belong to that society. There's the political and the financial issues of not having the same rights. And then there's a lot of inner work as well of not accepting oneself because we're not like everyone else. And
I like that you bring that up, Melissa, because one of the points when Cindy and I were discussing this, we were talking about inner marginalization, which is something that we all do to ourselves. There are aspects of ourselves that we deny, that we suppress, that we marginalize. And so that's a common thread, I think, for all people. But it's even more so when one internalizes that they are not part of the mainstream. And then that there's that much more to deal with, I think.
Absolutely, and I think that gets into this happens not only with the groups that you mentioned at the beginning of this call, but it happens if you look at any teenager. They're trying to find the group that they fit into. Yeah. And so it takes a while for us to actually come out and to be who we are and not try to fit into what we think we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The issue of where you belong in society is really closely tied to a sense of identity. And so exactly what you're saying is true, that it's a process we all experience regardless of how we identify. The other thing that Rami and I often talk about and think about is the idea that marginalization really at some level in terms of our individual psychology is occurring all the time. We're always having to marginalize different parts of our experience and different parts of our awareness. If we had to deal with all of the, for instance, just sensory information and internal coordination that's going on in our bodies from moment to moment and couldn't marginalize that, it would be very difficult to do anything at all. So marginalization is happening all the time, but when it becomes systematized in a culture, as happens frequently, then it becomes a social issue as well as a psychological issue.
And what we're talking about today is very personal to both of you, because you've had some personal experiences in a marginalized population. Is that something you'd like to share?
Well, I can start with my early childhood. Actually, I was brought up as a Jewish child. I was born right after the war, Second World War, and I knew right from the beginning, even though I didn't understand anything about the war, that it was dangerous to be Jewish. And so that was something that I grew up knowing. It was dangerous to be Jewish. It was dangerous to be a woman, and then went on from there. So that was the beginnings of my awareness that somehow I didn't belong, that it was that it was a problem. And to this day, there are still parts of me that feel a bit afraid. Go ahead.
And I would say, interestingly enough, I had kind of a back of the hand experience to Rami. I grew up in a Jewish community, but was not Jewish. And although I felt apart and different from my friends and their families in many respects, I also have been the recipient of a huge gift of being able to absorb parts of that culture that weren't a part of my family of origin and that actually benefited me. So different kinds of ideas and aspirations that weren't in my family, I was able to catch on to through my friends and their families and some of their ideas. So that was really, a plus for me.
I was in a group about 10 years ago, maybe more, maybe about 15 years ago. It was a growth and development, open-hearted, connected kind of experience. And it was about a 10-day process. And there was a woman in the group who used to drive to the meditation, let's say, this process with me every day. And she would never speak with me. And I eventually found out that she was a neo-Nazi. And she said to me in the group process, she said, "I have only one regret in life." And I said, "What is that?" And she said that Hitler didn't get the job done, that he didn't annihilate people like you. And I thought, this is like, it was so long since I'd been afraid. But then there it is right in my face. And I was just so shocked by that. And I thought, maybe I shouldn't be so shocked. Maybe I've just been lucky that I haven't had to deal with that kind of thing. And then 2 years later, a man on our street here in Skokie was murdered by a neo-Nazi who was out on a joyride, and he killed Ricky Birdsong, who you might know, who was a friend of ours. He was the basketball coach at Northwestern. And he was out walking with his children one night, and he was murdered by this man who also shot some Jewish people returning from synagogue. So I say this all because I think we think it's relatively safe, and it is relatively safe, and these kinds of incidences don't occur that often, but it's still in the background. So to feel like we belong and that we can be free to speak, yes and no. I think both are true.
And I think you bring up, and thank you for sharing your experiences, there's a couple of different things in there. It's interesting when we're the majority and when we're the minority, because you guys did have the reverse experiences, and it depends on where you are. I remember taking a African American studies class in college, and I was the only Caucasian in the class. And it really gave me that feeling of being the other. And one of the powerful things I remember leaving that class with was, number one, there was fear. The first day I decided, was I going to come back or not? Because I did feel that otherness and that possibility of attack that I never felt before. And the other thing was where all of a sudden I became responsible for speaking for the entire white race. That, I was the touch point. Well, what do you think about that? And so it's really interesting how those roles develop. So I think at one time or another, we've all experienced being in that other. But the other examples you brought up about actual hate and hate with attack, how do you think how does that all play with this? And is there a way that can be healed? Is there a way that we can begin to find acceptance no matter what group we're in?
Well, in our work, Melissa, we focus a lot on helping people understand marginalization as an inner phenomena so that healing can begin. Because you could live in any society, in any culture, but if inside yourself there are parts of you that you don't accept or disavow or really hate, then you can't escape that experience. So I think one of the things that is interesting to me in your example of the class you were in is that this capacity to tolerate being different is really central to beginning to explore different aspects of yourself, inside of yourself as well as in the world, in groups, and in different places in society.
Yes, I think that's great what Cindy is saying, and I think it's also the ability to see that I also have hatred. I also have a part of me that is a killer, in a sense. There are parts of me that I kill off, and in my thinking, might kill off in you. So it's just what Cindy is saying. It's getting in touch with that the other is me, and I am the other. That's the way that I think healing occurs.
Can you say more about that, Rami, about I am the other and the other is me?
Yeah. Well, this has to do with a very deep, Cindy and I talk about this idea of deep democracy, which has to do with that all parts, everything that exists in you also exists in me. There's nothing that anyone is that I am not also. There is no quality, characteristic, or anything that's out there that isn't also in me. I am exactly, I may have an expression as my personality that's different than you, but I also know that lives in me. After 9/11, Cindy and I did a seminar for advertising, is an advertising agency, on the terrorist within, because our tendency is to just point at that the terrorist is out there, the killer is out there, whatever that other is out there. But in really looking at myself, I see how I terrorize myself with my own feelings of inadequacy or whatever it is. And then I may project it out on you, like you're the terrorist. But truly, it lives in me as well in a different way.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. Go ahead, Cindy.
Yeah.
So for us, one of the things that really makes a huge difference is being able to include all of those voices, whether those voices are inside of us or in a small group or community that we're living in or working in. That wholeness in the sense of inclusion is really key to healing and to overcoming some of the problems we face inside of ourselves, but also between ourselves as people and cultures and countries and communities.
Absolutely. And we're human. We see things. We're gonna notice differences. Anybody who says they don't notice a difference is lying. I'm gonna know you're tall and I'm short. I'm gonna notice that. It's what do we do with that once we notice it? Do we add a judgment onto it? Yeah. Do we add fear onto it? Or going to Rami's point, I think it's really interesting when I work with clients, when there's usually somebody in their life that's annoying them, it's the thing they need to heal in themselves. And so a lot of times when we're triggered by the other, it's actually seeing our reflection in them that's actually triggering us.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the biggest learnings, currently, Cindy and I have been facilitating a polyamory support group for the last 5 years. And we've seen, somewhere between 600 and 800 people come through that group. And to hear the commonality of the pains of trying to be a part of the culture, to be a part of a family. It's a coming out process for people in the same way that the LGBTQ community feels. And I think that the fear is that they won't be accepted and that they're not accepted. It's not only a fear, it's a reality. People are isolated from their families or disowned by families. And it's merely a question for me of a set of beliefs and conditioning that people are not willing to look at. There are social structures that have been created. How do we deal with them? Carefully, with patience, and coming together to be able to share our common pains and experiences.
And with that, I know there's been counselors that have helped over the years to help people through this process. And I know your process is the one that you have at Lifeworks is a little bit different. But is there a tendency to have bias and judgment and kind of that blame the victim in some of the traditional ways we go about the healing?
That's a great question, Melissa.
There's a tendency to confuse and to collapse two things in general. One is the fact that someone is marginalized, and then whatever their personal conflict or disturbance is, and to see one as the result of the other. That's a kind of blaming the victim that can happen. And therapists are not exempt from doing this. They need to have a recognition of that distinction between the impact of the experience of social marginalization and the inner conflicts, histories, or disturbances and problems that the person has faced regardless of their particular identification or marginalization.
Okay, so it's actually separating what the person is experiencing from the group or the label that they have. So it's really dealing with the individual and not dealing with...
not seeing people through the lens of their identity, but just recognizing their underlying humanity and struggle.
But I have to say, it's a very common problem. I hear it all the time. I have many clients who have been to other therapists who have, first of all, felt that they had to educate their therapist about whatever the issue is, and then maybe experiencing bias. Like people frequently in the polyamory community will say that their therapist told them to stop having the affair or whatever it is. They weren't really open to it for whatever reason. And I think that that's a very common problem and very difficult. We have people come here from Indiana, from Michigan, from all over, because they know that we are explicitly inclusive, and because we really do invite people from those communities, having had our own experiences or having had our own life experiences. It really helps in our professional experiences. So they know they can come here and feel that they can speak whatever's going on with them.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important, it's not only the communities that you're mentioning, but, we might have other biases. We may have other hopes for people. So whether you're a counselor or a family member or, whatever the role is that you have, there are wishes that we want for other people. It could be totally positive, but because we have that wish versus meeting the person where they are and who they are, it adds that bias and can stifle the process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's great that you're able to open it up to more than what we're talking about, actually. That's good. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Lifeworks here in the Chicagoland area and, what's your mission and who do you work with and how are you different?
Just hold on to it. Yeah.
Sorry.
So right now, Lifeworks has 2 locations. We have one here in Skokie. We're a group practice that right now we're 6 clinicians. We also have an office in Lakeview on Lincoln. And what did you ask us? Our mission and our...
And who do you serve? And how do you do it differently than other places?
So we're explicitly inclusive, which means we welcome and work with diversity in all of its forms, and that we are seeing clients from all kinds of backgrounds who are experiencing all kinds of different problems, either based on an identity that they have that may be marginalized or just normal life problems that we all have: depression, anxiety, trouble with our marriages, our families, and things like that. How we work that we feel is a bit different is that we have an approach that focuses on seeing the problem as a pathway to the solution, and really trying less to fix the problem or change it and get rid of it than to go more deeply into it and to really understand what the value is that that problem is bringing to us, and how we can pick up and use, as you said, some of that disturbance to address areas of our lives that can use some of that.
So we see individuals, couples plus. So it could be a couple and their other partners. So sometimes it could be a triad or a quad or whatever. So that's something that I think is a little bit different about us. And as Cindy said, we always consider that the solution is through the disturbance, not trying to get rid of the disturbance per se. That the disturbance itself is bringing information, something that they might need.
Absolutely, and I believe in that as well. I think we as a society see the disturbance or the symptom or the pain as something we want to get rid of, and instead, if it's something that we delve into, we can actually find the true cause and find true healing.
Yes.
So, absolutely. So,
sounds like you do that kind of work too, Melissa.
Yes, I do. I think that's the healing work that we're all meant to do right now. There's definitely a trend towards finding out who we truly are and accepting ourselves, warts and all, and being able to dig deep and not to hide from those challenges, but to be able to use them to grow into who we're meant to be. And it's amazing to see so many people taking the risk to do that work.
Yeah. I think we're very fortunate that we came across a paradigm called process-oriented psychology about 15 years ago. And that is like the foundation for the work. It's a very interesting paradigm in that it really is very Taoistic and has a very nature-based and body-based kind of therapy. I can talk a lot about that, but just as a little tickler.
Absolutely, and I think the process work and the work that you both do is very powerful because it isn't just mental work. It is actually incorporating the body. It's almost, I worked with a shaman before, and it's almost with that because it's taking in the entire person and getting this out of their minds and into ourselves. And I think there's great healing that can happen there. Yeah.
The focus of a lot of therapies now is on cognition, is on insight, is on what we think and how we think about things. And that's very important and can't be left out of the equation. But our focus is more on the experience of the whole individual and finding healing through a deeper experience of oneself as opposed to different thoughts about oneself. We think experience comes first and then you change your thinking versus change your thinking and then have a different experience.
And I think it can happen either way, but I agree with you. It's very powerful to go from the feeling to the thought. And a lot of times when my clients are stuck, they're stuck in their thought. And if we can get to their unconscious or get to their feeling or their emotion, we can start seeing a shift.
Well, we also get to their nature, which is kind of beyond the feelings and emotions. It's like, what is, sorry.
You don't have to say anything.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me right now, the screen just went blank, but a lot of the time that we're sitting here, what's behind you is a tree. And I keep thinking about the nature of a tree. right? And if I were working with someone and they were staring at a tree, I might ask them, what is it that you're looking at and what's interesting about that? And then to really see that there might be something tree-like in that individual, right? That there's something deeply rooted, but they're not in touch with it. So to bring more access to a person's nature, in addition to their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, their personality, their cognition, it goes really, really deep, which is, it's wonderful. Having had a lot of background in spirituality, I started meditating when I was about 17 and doing psychology and psychotherapy for several decades. It's brought together the two, which is really very powerful work for me.
And I think that is part of the powerful time that we're in, is that it's not just the cognitive work anymore, but we're starting to see how our unconscious and our emotions and our nature and our whole self, our bodies as well, what we feed our bodies affects everything. So it's really getting into that holistic approach.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're coming up at the end of our show here, but I wanted to see if you had any final thoughts about why you think marginalization continues to occur, or what your call is to help other people who either feel marginalized or to help transform our society to be more open.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a big question. I think marginalization is part of life. I don't know that we'll get rid of it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's bad when it becomes systematized and prevents people from accessing the same powers and privileges that other people are able to have. So that would be my first response to that. I think in our practice, we're really very interested in providing a space where people who are experiencing social marginalization or inner oppression of some form can find a way to access more freedom around that. And that's something we're very committed to in terms of the culture inside of our practice and the way that it reaches out into the world.
Mm. What piqued my ear when you asked that question was your calling. And I think back to when I was a child and how sensitive I was to everyone and everything, basically. And I always had a feeling like I wish I could save the world, or I do something that would make a difference, because I became aware at a very young age that not everyone had what I had, that I was privileged in the ways in which I was, even though I lived in a 2-room apartment in the Bronx in New York, felt like we had the world in that tiny little space. But I was aware that there were children in Harlem who were very unfortunate and living in terrible poverty and conditions. I started seeing that when I was 6 and 7 years old. So at the very beginnings of my life, I always felt like I had a deep feeling for wanting to make things better somehow. And I think that in our simple ways, in the ways in which we do it, it's met my calling. I feel very privileged to work with people. I said to someone the other day, I feel like we work with people's difficulties, but we also work with people's souls. It's a very sacred experience for me doing psychotherapy, which I didn't know it would be. But it's turned out that way, and I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to work with people.
Yes, it's very beautiful, and your work is very powerful. You're reaching groups that don't necessarily have the support or the resources. So it's really great the work you do, and I know there's a ripple effect. So I want to thank both of you very much, Cindy and Rami, for being on the show and sharing about how we can make inward changes to change the way that we experience society. So thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Melissa. Nice talking with you.
Join Melissa Heisler next week right here at The Empowerment Show. Join the conversation at facebook.com/The Empowerment Show or twitter.com/Empowerment Show.